Okay, the next question he addresses here is, what is a programming language? Basically, he says a programming language is something that can make a decision. Now, I'm not sure that's a standard definition of programming languages. You can look up programming language in Wikipedia, and I think you'll get a good answer to what is a programming language. So the next topic is working with variables, or using variables, and we've obviously used variables many times already. He says a variable is something that you store a value in, and another way of thinking about a variable is it's a place that's in memory. It's a reserved spot in your computer's memory, and then you can fill that spot with whatever you want. You can fill it with a number, one number, or a different number. You might fill it with a name. It depends, right? But we can think of a variable as a reserved place in the memory of the computer. So we're not going to do this example, and you don't have to do it, but let's just read it quickly. So what does he do here? Oh, first of all, he has a button, and then what does he do? He declares int number as integer. Then he assigns a value to int number, and then he takes the current value of int number, which is 27, and he adds 1 to it. And then he says the value of this is a message box, and this is a string up to here, right? So that's just a string, right? It says the value of int number plus 1 equals. So that's going to appear over here. Okay? And then he has a concatenation operator, and then he has this. So what is this? This is the toString method for something of type integer. So the something of type integer has a method called the toString method, and what will it do? It will take the integer and convert it to a string so that it can go nicely into this message box. And so, of course, if you run it, you're going to see this. Now, when he describes how this works, he says, when using numeric variables in text, which is what we were doing, because we have an int number there, and it's in text here, because it's in the message show in here. It's a good idea. It's a good idea to use the toString method to cast. To cast means to convert the numeric value to a string. This makes the code easier to read and understand because you know that you are working with strings. Now here's one more interesting thing that we should read. Now I told you that dim comes from the word dimension, and that comes from we talk about an x variable and a y variable, but here's a slightly different interpretation of this word dim. So let's just read it just for interest. Dim is a keyword, as stated in chapter 1. Remember, a keyword is just an important word, a reserved word in Visual Basic or in a programming language. So you don't want to use dim like to name a variable. You don't want to call a variable dim because it already has a meaning in Visual Basic. It's a reserved word or a keyword. Anyway, dim is a keyword. As stated in chapter 1, a keyword has special meaning in Visual Basic 2010 and is used for things such as commands. Dim tells Visual Basic 2010 that what follows is a variable definition. Well, we know that. But anyway, its curious name harks back to the original versions of the BASIC language. So before Visual Basic, there was a language called BASIC. BASIC has always needed to know how much space to reserve for an array. And we still haven't talked about arrays, but we're going to. So that it had a command to indicate the dimensions of the array. Dim, for short, the dimensions of the array. So they're talking about it's the size of an array. Visual Basic extends that command to all other kinds of variables as well, to mean make some space for this variable. Okay, so slightly different way of thinking about it. Okay, now we want to talk about comments and white space. Now you know about comments. We've talked about how to do comments, and that he tells you that it's a very good idea to make comments in your code. He says that other languages also allow you to make comments, but they don't use like an apostrophe. They might use like a double slash, or there's lots of different ways to indicate that what follows is a comment. But in Visual Basic we know that we use an apostrophe. He also here reminds us that you can put a comment on the same line as code. So you can put a comment afterwards. Now you can't put any code after this, because whatever comes after this apostrophe will just be considered comment. But you can put comment on the same line as your code, like he's done here. Okay, now the next thing he tells us actually is a kind of pretty cool comment feature that Visual Studio has for us. So whenever you want to give comments for a method, you can, now let's look at this. This is a method. It's actually a button click, but it's also a button click method. We call it a method. And it takes some arguments, or we say some parameters. So it takes this is a parameter. Now we haven't talked enough about this yet, but this is one of the arguments, or one of the parameters. And it also takes another one here. Again, we haven't really talked about what we mean by this, but anyway, it takes some parameters. Remember, functions, and we put arguments into functions, like we put x into a function f, right? So anyway, if you have a method like this, and maybe it takes parameters or it doesn't, but anyway, if you just type 3 apostrophes in a row, you get all of that there for you. And then you can give a summary of what this method is supposed to do, and you can also talk about the parameters for this method, and it actually identifies what the parameters are for the method, so it knows that sender is one of the parameters and e is another one. So you can describe what these are, and you can also, it has an extra space for remarks. So that's pretty good. And this is just a comment. This whole thing is just a comment. It doesn't affect the code at all. And when you do it this way, then you have all of this, and this is kind of standardized, so that when other people look at it, they sort of know what to look for, because it's always the same. It's always a summary, parameter description, remarks, and there might be another part when you return something. There might be another part here. But anyway, it's standardized, and so that's pretty good. So when you're defining a method, it might be good to use this commenting scheme in order to describe or comment about what that method is supposed to do. Next thing he talks about is white space, and that just means putting spaces in between your code. So you might have this code here, and he says don't be afraid to put a lot of white space there. So you can put lots of white space there, he says, and it actually makes your code usually easier to read. So don't be afraid to do that. He says the compiler, that is the Visual Studio, converts your program into machine language so that it can actually run it. That's the compiler. Ignores white space and comments. So there are no performance differences. Doesn't slow down your code at all between code with a lot of white space and comments and code with none. Okay, let's talk about data types next.